A cold gunshot echoed through the empty street. The loyal K-9, who had braved countless missions alongside Black Special Agent Marissa Hayes, collapsed instantly. Worse still, before the pain could even settle, Marissa, bruised, beaten, and dragged away like a criminal, was forced to confront a corrupt police system, hell-bent on burying the truth with violence and media spin. That loss lit a fire. It burned through the mask of hypocrisy and sparked an extraordinary journey of resistance. But can a woman once dragged across the pavement rise to take down a system built to silence her? Tell us where you're watching from, and follow the fight as Delta Agent Hayes reclaims her name. Marissa Hayes' shadow stretched long across the concrete sidewalk as the sun dipped behind the trees, cast an amber light through rows of shedding maples. A breeze lifted the hem of her fitted athletic jacket, brushing against a body built by discipline, not the image most people had in mind when they pictured a regular black woman. She walked with the calm precision of someone in full control, each step deliberate, as if rehearsed thousands of times, exact, silent, and leaving no room for error. People in this neighborhood didn't look at her like a neighbor out for a walk after work. They looked at her like she was carrying something dangerous inside her. A middle-aged man slowed his hose on the lawn across the street, watching her. A housewife peeked through parted curtains as Marissa and Rex passed the wooden fence. These stares weren't new. They didn't come from war zones. They came from peaceful suburban streets, places where someone like her, too poised, too black, didn't fit the invisible map of assumptions others carried in their heads. Rex stayed close to her side, his stride mechanical, exact. No one could mistake the German shepherd for a household pet. The collar around his neck read K-9. Retired, but his eyes were still as sharp as they'd been in combat. Marissa wasn't the expressive type. Her face gave little away, but now and then she ran her hand gently along the back of Rex's neck, a signal of reassurance. There was a strange quiet in the air that made her tense. Too many eyes, too much silence, too little reason. Rex gave a low growl as they crossed the third intersection. A police cruiser was idling at the corner. She glanced at it without stopping. Rex didn't look away. His ears pricked, throat humming like he could hear the static of violence ready to crackle. Her grip on the leash tightened slightly. The faint clink of metal was more warning than noise. The cruiser pulled out. Tires hissed softly against the asphalt. Marissa's steps grew heavier under the weight of an all-too-familiar sensation, the feeling of being hunted, in a place she was supposed to call home. The window rolled down. A man's voice called out. Officer Nick sat behind the wheel, trying to sound friendly, but the bulging vein under his collar betrayed the energy he was barely holding back. "Good evening, ma'am. Can you tell us what you're doing in this area?" Marissa turned, letting the slanting light catch the high planes of her face and the blade-sharp calm in her eyes. She had been asked this question before, in Arabic, in Polish, even in Quebecois French during overseas ambushes, but only in America, her birthplace, did it hurt like this. "I live here," she said, her voice clear and velveted steel, "walking my dog." Another officer, Luke, bald and stocky, stepped out from the passenger seat. He nodded at Nick and gave Marissa a long, scanning look. His eyes didn't bother hiding suspicion. "You live here? Can we see some ID?" Marissa nodded. Slowly, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. Rex angled his body slightly, lowering his head into a defensive posture. No command needed. A flick of her finger, and he held position. Luke took the ID and read her license. Marissa Hayes. That name sounds familiar. Weren't you decorated by the military or something? "I was. Just returned home." Luke muttered under his breath, not quite convinced, then cleared his throat. "We've had reports of drug activity in the area lately. You understand? We have to follow up on anything suspicious." Marissa's eyes stayed locked on his, "I'm a former Delta Force operative," she replied, voice even and steady, like a field report. "I don't sell drugs. I live here, and unless you have a warrant, I suggest you move along." A pause. Then Nick smirked. "Well, nice speech. Looks like we interrupted the peaceful evening walk of an educated woman." Luke added, "Still, drug runners are clever these days, and people tend to report those who don't look like they belong. Simple as that." Marissa tilted her head slightly. The wind tugged at her hair, sharpening her gaze. Maybe people should take a look at themselves before deciding who does or doesn't belong. The radio crackled from inside the cruiser. Luke folded her ID and handed it back, but the look in his eyes had shifted. No longer curious, just confrontational. On that deceptively quiet street, an unspoken battle line had just been drawn. The ID was handed back, but the air between them didn't settle. It thickened, ready to ignite. Marissa slipped the card into her pocket with the precision of someone trained to stay calm under fire. Her fingers gently curled, thumb brushing the knuckle of her middle finger, a reflex control move she'd mastered during her early Delta Force days. Because if she'd reacted on instinct alone, Nick would already be face down on the pavement in under 2 seconds. Rex remained in guard stance at her heel, head lowered, eyes locked onto the 2 uniformed men putting on a show of power in broad daylight. He didn't bark or growl, but the tension in his shoulder muscles had begun to harden, something only Marissa could read. This situation was slipping past the safe zone. Luke stepped closer, shorter than Nick, but the kind of man who overcompensated with crude bravado. The ignorant confidence of a white man convinced that a badge gave him license to stand above others. He stared at Marissa, not with curiosity, but the kind of appraisal reserved for objects that confuse or threaten. "Don't see folks like you around here," he said, drawing out the words like he was savoring them. "Tall, built, that jacket's not doing much to hide those arms." His eyes flicked down to Rex, then back up, curling into a smirk. "You're not exactly the type to bring cupcakes to the neighbors, huh?" Marissa didn't smile. She didn't need to. I don't bake cupcakes. I do the kind of work where, if we were on a battlefield, I'd be the one pulling your ass out from an IED. Luke scoffed. "A woman with a gun? Come on. I bet you don't even need one to look dangerous." He mimed unzipping her jacket, then clucked his tongue. "You shouldn't be out here with a dog that size, dressed all in black. Someone might mistake you for a bounty hunter." Marissa let out a small, dry laugh. Not amusement, but clarity. She'd just seen this man for who he really was, a weak officer clinging to his authority not to protect, but to perform for women. And the darker the woman, the smaller he tried to make her. She spoke slowly, every word sharp and deliberate. "You think you're clever? Disguised harassment is one of the cheapest ways to test a woman's patience, especially a woman of color. I bet this little game is part of your weekly routine." Nick stepped out of the car, hands on his hips, voice colder now. The fake friendliness had evaporated. "That's enough, Hayes," he said. "We can arrest you for noncompliance." Marissa turned to face them both. She didn't move forward, didn't back away, but the way she stood, spine straight, feet grounded like she was in the middle of a war zone, made both men feel suddenly less certain, even though they held the guns and she held nothing. "I have complied. I handed you ID. I confirm my address. I haven't broken a single law," she said, clipped and clear. Luke shrugged and sneered. "We got a report about someone suspicious in the area. Coincidentally, it was a large black individual walking with a retired K-9. You know the drug crime rate in your community?" That sentence dropped like a stone, straight into the heart of what this really was. A white cop, in broad daylight, telling a black veteran who had bled and sweated for her country that her skin alone made her a suspect. Rex growled low, throat vibrating. One more provocation and his training would kick in. Marissa slowly lowered her hand, running it down the back of Rex's head. "Hold position," she whispered, only loud enough for the dog to hear. Nick stepped closer, wedging himself between her and Luke, not to de-escalate, but to escalate himself. His words were both accusation and bait. "You think carrying a weapon once gives you the right to stand above the law? You think a few nice lines in your file means you get to strut around like a general?" She answered flatly, "No, but I do know how to read the law better than you." That was the moment Nick snapped. His face darkened. He clenched his jaw, then spat out a sentence that froze the air. "Women like you need to remember their place." Luke blinked at the line, then laughed, a satisfied, mean-spirited laugh, as if Nick had finally stopped pretending. Marissa didn't move. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. But her eyes trained to read an enemy's intent from a single change in breath, were now bulletproof. "What exactly does that mean, officer?" Nick didn't answer. The street was as silent as when she'd first stepped out of her home. But this silence was no longer peaceful. It was the stillness before the storm. Marissa knew it, and she understood. This was the moment where things would spiral, not because she provoked it, but because they had chosen the wrong woman to try and break. A light breeze swept down the quiet street, rustling the dry maple leaves beneath Rex's paws. But he no longer noticed. The battle-worn German shepherd was shifting states. His ears stood rigid, shoulders lifted, legs braced, and the skin over his nose wrinkled. Clear signs of total alert. A low, steady growl began to rise from his throat, the kind of warning only those who danced with death before could truly understand. Danger was close, pressing in. Marissa heard the sound and knew, if she hesitated for even a heartbeat, if her hand didn't land exactly where it needed to on Rex's back, the consequences would be irreversible. She dropped down smoothly, pressing her palm between his shoulder blades, using that voice, the same voice that once froze an entire special ops unit in place under gunfire. "Stay down, Rex." No reaction. He shuddered but obeyed. His muscles stayed taut, but his jaws slowly shut. The growl remained in his throat, but he held his ground. By instinct and training, Rex trusted her, knew she was still in control, and that was just enough to keep him from launching into full defense. Marissa tightened her grip on the leash and subtly stepped between Rex and the two officers, cutting the line of sight. She took a deep breath, trying to smother the rage pounding in her chest. She'd kept calm when comrades had bled out beside her in war zones. Today, she had to stay calm so she wouldn't destroy two men hiding behind badges and acting like thugs. Luke watched her with a mix of challenge and twisted delight. He'd seen the shift in Rex. He'd heard the growl. He knew they'd push this woman to the brink, and instead of pulling back, he stepped closer. "Keep that dog in check," he said, fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. "Casual, but not accidental. If it bites, I won't hesitate to shoot." Nick stood behind him, arms crossed, his expression stripped of all pretense. Only contempt remained. "I told you, Hayes. Know your place, and it's not strutting down the street like some damn general." Marissa raised her head. Her eyes met his, razor sharp, unflinching, not loud, but cutting straight through the hollow pride of a man addicted to control. "I don't need to school you on civil rights or animal protection laws, but if you're staging a situation just to get an excuse to pull that trigger, find someone easier to manipulate. I'm not her." She gave the leash a gentle tug. "Let's go, Rex." Marissa walked away. Her spine stayed straight. Her stride remained steady. Rex moved beside her in perfect sync. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She chose the one thing these officers couldn't tolerate. She ignored them. And that, more than any word she could have spoken, is what set Nick off. "Stop." His voice dropped, low and venomous. "I said stop." Marissa didn't turn. She'd survived enough ambushes to know When someone starts barking orders without cause, it means they've lost control, and that's when they're most dangerous. You're resisting a lawful order. Final warning. She was 2 steps from the curb when the sound of a gun being drawn cut through the air. Don't take another step. Luke chambered around. I'm serious. Marissa turned slowly, hands at her sides. Her gaze dropped to the weapon in his grip, then calmly lifted to meet his eyes. I'm unarmed and not resisting. Why are you pointing a gun at a civilian who hasn't made a single threat? Nick circled behind her. His voice came cold, metallic. Because you're suspicious. And now I want you to turn around. Hands behind your head. She didn't move. That order, turn around, hit like a psychological tripwire. Any soldier knows it. Turning your back means surrendering control, inviting attack, accepting that you might be blindsided, restrained, or worse. Killed before you can react. Rex began to growl again, louder this time. Leash tightening. Marissa could feel the rhythm of his pulse vibrating up through her palm. They were surrounded, hemmed in by prejudice, where the line between lawful authority and brute force was no thicker than a finger on a trigger. Are you going to turn, or do I have to restrain you? Nick asked, his hand now hovering near the taser. Marissa exhaled, slowly. In a fraction of a second, her mind raced through options. She could break Luke's wrist before he fired. She could drop Nick with a shoulder lock in 3 moves, but everything she'd ever learned in combat was meant to defend, not to fight against uniforms in her own country, especially not on a street where one scream, "She's attacking the police," would drown out the truth in a heartbeat. She looked down at Rex. He looked back, those deep brown eyes asking, "Are we moving?" She gave the faintest shake of her head. Number. Then, slowly, Marissa turned. Her shoulders stayed straight, but her hands, tightly clenched, knuckles white, rose into the air. She was choosing the hardest strategy of all, absolute self-control, in a fight where every rule had been rigged against her. Their shadows stretched long across the street, bathed in the amber light of late afternoon. The air around them had grown unbearably heavy, like an invisible wire pulled to its limit, trembling under tension. One wrong move away from snapping. Luke's footsteps echoed behind her, deliberate, heavy, each one pounding the pavement like a drumbeat that reached into the deepest corners of Marissa's muscle memory. It wasn't Mosul. It wasn't Fallujah. This was America, the country where she once believed she had the right to simply live as a citizen. Her hands, now resting behind her head, felt ice cold against her scalp. Blood pulsed hard at the base of her neck, her body instinctively warning her that control was slipping. Luke moved in, too close. His breath hit her skin, stale with cigarettes and cheap mouthwash. His hands slowly moved over her jacket pockets, not in haste but with intentional slowness, dragging out the sensation like it was meant to violate not just her body, but her worth. He crouched by her hip, far lower than necessary, and reached for her wallet. When his fingers brushed the waistband of her jeans, a wave of revulsion raced down her spine. She stiffened, her jaw locked, her body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer will it took to restrain the inferno rising in her blood. She could have broken his jaw with a single elbow strike. Half a second was all it would take, but she held back. Beside her, Rex gave a low growl. His front paw lifted, ears flattened. A deep, vibrating sound rumbled from his chest. Not loud, but loud enough for Nick to narrow his eyes and instinctively grip the handle of his gun. "Control your dog," he snapped. "I am," Marissa answered, her voice crisp, eyes forward, shoulders rigid, but deep inside, past training and muscle memory, her sharpest instinct whispered the truth. Nothing was under control anymore. Luke kept searching. His hand slid lower, then abruptly pushed at her knee, pretending to inspect her boot but shoving hard, deliberate, invasive. And that was the final line. Rex snapped. The dog surged forward, driven by one pure instinct: protect. He leapt between his handler and the threat, reacting as he'd been trained to after thousands of hours in the field. Swift, focused, fearless. "Rex! No!" Marissa shouted, but her voice had barely formed when she heard it. Click. The cold, unmistakable sound of a safety being released. One heartbeat, one breath, then the shot. The gunfire cracked through the street like thunder. Raw, brutal, and final. Rex's body froze midair. A short, wrenching cry burst from his throat, sharp and unbearable. Then, like a stone cut loose from gravity, he collapsed to the pavement, blood pouring from his side into a thick, dark pool beneath his fur. No! The scream tore from Marissa's chest, but it wasn't the cry of someone mourning a pet. It was the sound of someone who had stepped over corpses in war zones, who had witnessed death too many times, but never imagined holding the body of the one companion who had never left her side, killed at point blank by those sworn to protect. She dropped to her knees, pulling Rex's body close. His warmth was already slipping away. Blood soaked into her pants, into her palms, and across the concrete like a lifeline draining out. "Rex, Rex, can you hear me?" she whispered, the words scraping through the tight knot of a sob lodged in her throat. His eyes, still open, dulled but not yet empty, found hers, searching, still waiting, as if hoping for a command, a reason, a second chance. But there was nothing left. She pressed both hands to the wound, an instinct honed by years of saving lives, now useless in the face of losing the only being who had ever trusted her without condition. "You should have held him back, Hayes," Nick said flatly, voice devoid of anything but bureaucratic coldness. "I warned you." But Marissa didn't respond. She didn't hear him anymore. Her ears rang with silence. The only sound left in her mind was the echo of the shot. Luke took a step back, his face drained of color. He glanced at Nick, then at Rex, and for the first time that day his eyes betrayed fear. Marissa cradled Rex's head, placing it gently on her lap. The street around them, once still and suburban, was now splashed red, his blood soaking the concrete, rewriting the scene into something far more brutal. She collapsed forward, her body folding as if her bones had lost their strength. Her hands, trembling, cupped his face with a tenderness so full of anguish it slowed time. She looked like a mother holding a child mid-dream, wishing, begging for it to be just exhaustion, not goodbye. No, no, this can't be real. She pressed her ear to his chest. No heartbeat, only cold, only stillness, only silence. "Help him. Please, someone call. Emergency. Please." Her voice cracked, a rasp shredded by grief. Each word sounded like it was ripped from the bottom of her lungs. She looked up at Luke, the man who had touched her without reason, and now stood paralyzed. Her eyes, once trained to stay unreadable even under fire, now, welled with so much sorrow, they looked like they held a sky breaking into rain. No command, no title, just a woman, she whispered, voice barely audible. Just a woman begging, "Please save him." "He wasn't just a dog," she cried suddenly, voice shattering. "He was my teammate. He protected me on foreign soil. He was the last thing I trusted, and you killed him like he was nothing." She bent lower, clutching his fur, still wet with blood, trying to stop what couldn't be stopped, and when her fingers felt that stillness, that unbearable lightness where his heart used to beat, something inside her broke. No, this can't be the end. A quiet, shuddering sob slipped from her. She leaned forward until her head rested against his body, hugging him like something fragile and sacred. Her mind flooded with memories that burned like fire under the ash. She saw Fort Bragg 11 years ago. She was the only black woman in a room full of white men, the top scorer on every physical test, yet still treated like an outsider. But among all the stares, there was Rex, the young K-9 with sharp eyes and no prejudice, who walked up to her, unafraid, pressed his nose into her palm and chose her. They had been one unit ever since. He never broke focus during live fire drills. She remembered the day in Syria when she was trapped beneath rubble. He ran through gunfire to get help, then returned to lie across her body for 3 hours. His blood had stained her uniform then too, just like now. She thought of their first night home. Her apartment was silent, empty. Rex had curled beside the couch, head resting on her leg, those warm brown eyes always watching. Now, those eyes were closed. Marissa held his limp body tighter. The tears that fell were silent. Her voice came out as a whisper not even she could fully hear. "You protected me. Now I promise I'll protect the truth for both of us." And on that indifferent street, where justice had just been pulled like a trigger through the heart, only one thing remained. That promise. A promise, rising quietly, stronger than hate, sharper than grief. But behind her, cruelty was already closing in. Quietly, decisively, Nick gave Luke a glance. It was quick, but calculated. He knew who Marissa Hayes was, a Delta Force operative trained to take down 3 men with her bare hands. Her silence wasn't submission. It was a storm waiting in stillness, held back by sheer will. One misstep, and she would become the predator, and they would be the fools. Nick gave a subtle nod. It was all Luke needed to read the signal. Strike before the storm breaks. Marissa never saw it. She was still kneeling, hands trembling as they stroked the matted, blood-caked fur of her fallen companion. And then, precisely in that moment of deepest vulnerability, a bolt of electricity tore through the air and slammed into the base of her neck. Her body convulsed violently, then collapsed onto the cold pavement. No warning, no command, just the crackle of a taser pressed straight to her skin, and the satisfied click of Luke's tongue. "Forecast says, sudden thunderstorm," he chuckled, smug. Marissa went down as if felled by grief itself, but this was another kind of pain, a humiliation too brutal to be tactical. To be ambushed, shocked, and thrown to the ground while mourning a fallen comrade. There is no cruelty more calculated than that. Nick said nothing. He stepped forward, snapped cold metal cuffs around her wrists with an efficient, emotionless motion. Just business. Routine. Nothing to see here. Then he yanked her up. Marissa was still twitching, her muscles fried from the surge, her throat clenching with a sound that wasn't quite a cry, wasn't quite a protest, just the body trying to hold itself together. Her legs buckled, but Nick didn't let her fall. He dragged her forward, pulling her along the blistering pavement like a discarded object. "Careful there, Special Agent," Luke said, his voice coated in sugar but laced with venom. "Soldiers this soft? No wonder the country's in trouble." He gave her shoulder a casual kick as she stumbled, slamming her temple into a nearby light pole. A thin stream of blood slid down her forehead, blurred her vision, and mixed with whatever moisture was already clinging to her face. She couldn't tell if it was sweat or tears anymore. All she could feel was pain, endless, sensory-flooding pain. They dragged her like broken furniture down the empty street. The only sounds were the occasional clatter of a baton on concrete when Luke adjusted her restraints, and the faint whimpers she could no longer suppress. They threw her into the back seat of the cruiser like a busted sandbag. Nick slammed the door shut, hard, with intention, then slid behind the wheel. Luke climbed in beside him, propped his feet on the dash, and looked at her through the rearview mirror. "Should have kept the dog at home," he muttered. "Or," he added with a curled lip, "maybe remembered women like you belong behind a desk typing memos, not out here playing dog walker at night like some nutcase escapee." They both laughed, a cruel, echoing laugh that filled the small cabin, sharp and ugly, raking across her like claws against already torn skin. At that moment, she almost wished the taser had stopped her heart, so she wouldn't have to listen to one more word. A low sound escaped her throat, not from the wounds on her body, but from something deeper, a collapse too quiet for anyone else to hear. It was the sound of something breaking inside. Trust, belief, the last flicker of faith she'd carried in decency, in justice, in what Rex had always stood for. And as the patrol car rolled toward the station, toward a building where justice was just a word etched on a wall, Marissa understood something. Something inside her had just been extinguished. But from that dark and silent place, something else was beginning to burn. In the cold, dim holding cell of the police precinct, Marissa lay curled on the metal bench, her hands still cuffed in front of her, blood dried along her temple from where her head had struck the pavement. The physical pain no longer provoked a reaction, because the real agony burned in her chest, scorching through every memory, trust, and thread of belief she had left. Then, the sound of high heels echoed sharply down the hallway, like a war drum cutting through stillness. The door swung open. A woman in a black blazer stepped in without hesitation, hair pinned tightly, eyes blazing with fury. Every head in the room shifted, not because of rank, but because something had just entered that was bigger than authority itself. Her name was Mia Hayes. Mia, Marissa's younger sister, was neither a lawyer nor a politician, but she was the kind of woman the police hated most, an investigative journalist, trained to excavate cracks in systems, and with a voice that never backed down. She came armed not with weapons, but with a neatly bound stack of documents, a release order, a request for the full arrest file, and a certified copy of Marissa's military record, signed and stamped by the Department of Homeland Security. She slapped the folder onto the desk with a voice as sharp as a scalpel. "Release my sister. Now, unless you want this whole department on the front page tomorrow with the headline, 'Racism and the Torture of a Veteran.'" A duty officer stammered. "Ma'am, this case is still under review." "Wrong." Mia cut him off. "It's under cover-up." It took just 12 minutes to uncuff and release Marissa, but in those 12 minutes, Mia did more than any lawyer could. She looked every man in the room in the eye, memorized their names, ranks, and the hollow way they averted her gaze. When she finally helped Marissa out of the cell, her hand trembled, not from fear, but from a kind of heartbreak that, in the 21st century, a black woman in uniform could still be dragged like a criminal in the very country she defended. But that wasn't the hardest blow. Just a few blocks from the precinct, inside a small newsroom still lit near midnight, a man in a wrinkled shirt and loosened tie pounded out headlines on the front page of the morning edition. His forehead beaded with sweat, not from deadline pressure, but from a tip he'd just received from a police insider. A piece of raw, unverified bait that media vultures loved. Black ex-Special Forces operative causes disturbance in neighborhood. Dog attacks officers. Subject apprehended after resisting orders. They didn't need facts. What they needed was a story that stirred outrage. And now they had the perfect storm. A combat veteran, a trained K-9, and 2 white officers claiming they'd been threatened. Justice wasn't the goal. Drama was. He hit publish, and the lie took flight. On the front page the next morning, a photo of Marissa, taken from a low angle, her face twisted in pain, blood on her collar, hands cuffed, her eyes dark with grief, was blown up alongside a bold red headline. "Dangerous Veteran. Black Woman Unleashes Dog on Police." Page 3 opened with a line as sharp as a dagger. Marissa Hayes, a former Delta Force member, has been accused of inciting her dog to attack officers in a disturbing street incident. Sources suggest possible post-traumatic symptoms. Every word sculpted to reshape her into a threat. Unstable, combative, uncooperative, familiar language, crafted to condemn black lives without trial, terms the media had honed for decades. Marissa didn't finish reading. She didn't need to. Everything she saw in that paper told her exactly what she already knew, everything she'd spent a lifetime building. Her honor, her dignity, and Rex's memory had just been buried under headlines posing as truth. Mia knelt beside her and whispered, "Let me deal with the press. You don't have to say anything. I'll clear your name." But Marissa shook her head. She stood slowly, spine straight, like she was back in uniform, her gaze fixed beyond the glass toward the sky. It was no accident that this false narrative had spread so quickly. Nick and Luke weren't just bad apples. They were gears in a larger machine, one that had long since mastered rewriting truth before it ever had a chance to speak. Marissa understood now. This wasn't just about Rex anymore. This was about showing the world who the real threat was. Not a black woman walking her dog, but the men in uniform, fingers on triggers, mouths full of lies, and Marissa, who had survived war zones without ever once leading with anger, only strategy, knew exactly what needed to come next. She turned to Mia, voice level, measured, unshaken. "I need every internal complaint filed against this district's police department for use of force over the last 5 years. Personnel files, buried cases. Can you get them?" Mia nodded. "And you?" Marissa looked back at the paper. "I'll start with the two in uniform, but I'm not stopping there." Back at the precinct's break room, where the stale scent of coffee and old cigarettes hung in the air, Nick leaned back in a swivel chair, feet on the desk, chewing gum like the world outside had nothing to do with him. He flipped through the paper with a satisfied nod, tapping his finger on the headline like he'd written it himself. "Take a look, Luke," he said with crude delight. "Black woman incites dog to attack police. Fucking nailed it." Luke chuckled, eyes locked on his phone, screen full of angry comments, all directed at Marissa. He smirked, brushing a finger along the screen like petting a trophy. "Told you, man," he said smugly. "No need to raise a hand. Just feed the right bait to the media. Dog dead, vet disgraced, triple kill shot." Nick laughed louder, leaned in closer like he was sharing a dirty secret. "She might have survived combat zones," he whispered. "But here, we own the narrative. That's the real power." They both burst out laughing. A few drops of coffee spilled on the floor. No one cleaned it up. To them, justice was a headline, and lies, just another tool to keep their world exactly as it was. A soft breeze floated through the tall windows of Mia's office, carrying the dust of the city and the faint sweetness of March pollen. But inside the small conference room, where fluorescent lights glared down onto scattered files and laptops, no one noticed the season outside. Every eye in the room was locked onto the screen at the center, watching a blurry doorbell camera replay, frame shaken slightly, voices crackling beneath the interference. "Women like you need to remember their place. Control that dog before I shoot you both." The words were distorted but unmistakably heavy, like stones dropped into silence. No one spoke. The image didn't need to be clearer. The voices alone were enough to expose the truth behind the uniforms. Mia rose, eyes sweeping across her team, a small but lethal unit. Independent reporters who specialized in civil record digging, a sound engineer with courtroom experience in audio forensics, a former investigative TV producer who now ran a YouTube channel with millions of subscribers. She spoke with calm conviction. "We're not just clearing Marissa's name. We're tearing down a system that twists truth and giving it back to the truth itself." That line moved like a battle cry. Within hours, Mia distributed the video to a network of neutral and independent media outlets. Each detail was examined, each quote time-stamped. The footage was poor, the audio flawed, but with noise reduction tools they recovered enough. One phrase stood out. Marissa's voice, clear and controlled. "Rex, down." A command, not a provocation. Within 24 hours, the raw 3-minute clip, grainy and unpolished, went viral on Reddit, then Twitter, then TikTok. But Mia knew, in an information war, going viral wasn't enough. You needed someone to tell the story. So she partnered with an independent channel called True Voice, known for social documentaries. The second video was born, opening with a stark image of Marissa in an interrogation room, hands cuffed, fading into a photo of her in full combat gear. A calm narration followed. She once carried a rifle to protect millions, but when she came home, she was treated like a threat on the very street she defended. The impact was immediate. Comments flooded in, some siding with police. If she'd just followed orders, none of this would have happened. But many others asked harder questions. So, police can shoot a dog without warning. Why say she has PTSD with no medical basis? She's clearly calming the dog. How is that attacking? The debate spread like wildfire. Activists reposted the footage with bold captions. When the truth is edited, listen to what the camera heard. Meanwhile, Marissa, newly released and brought back to her apartment, sat wrapped in a blanket on her old sofa, eyes locked on the television where the evening news flashed across the screen. The crawl beneath the anchor read, "Nation divided over arrest of former Delta operative." And for the first time, a major outlet dared to include a smaller line beneath possible signs of police overreach. She exhaled slowly. Her eyes drifted to Rex's old leash, now hanging next to a framed photo of the two of them at Ramstein Training Base. Marissa in uniform, hand resting on Rex's head, while he grinned with that signature shepherd tongue lolling out. "They're starting to question," Mia said quietly, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. "And that's the first step toward truth mattering again." Marissa nodded faintly, but she didn't smile. Just as the subtitle faded, the segment cut to the opposition. A spokesperson for the Patrol Officers Association appeared, voice cold and formal. According to standard procedure, any perceived threat, including from an animal, can warrant the use of force. Rex growled and advanced on officers. They had no choice. Social media echoed with approval from some corners. "If a dog came at me like that, I'd pull the trigger too." Or worse, military background? Probably unstable. Cops did their job. Marissa looked up. Her eyes darkened, not with surprise but with confirmation. Not everyone wanted the truth. Some chose the version that made them feel safest, even when the facts were undeniable. "This is just the first front," she murmured. "They'll twist it again into something else." "Like what?" Mia asked. She turned to her sister, voice low and steady. "Authority, law, and shadows." In the days that followed, Marissa stayed out of public view. She moved with caution, even inspected every package left at her door. But, while she disappeared from sight, the media campaign intensified. Mia and a team of investigative journalists began reviewing every arrest involving Nick and Luke over the past 3 years. And amid that unfolding map of manipulation and misuse, Marissa remained still, the woman they thought they could bury with a headline and a single bullet. But now, as the truth began to surface and masks started slipping, the gaze of the public began to shift from suspicion to anger, from apathy to action. Following the first few reports that tilted public sympathy toward Marissa, a brief press conference was held at the Southgate District Police Headquarters. At the podium, a representative from Internal Affairs stood beside Chief Inspector Monroe, a familiar face, often wheeled out for damage control. Her voice was steady, flat, like reading a weather forecast. After reviewing case files, written reports, and available footage, including segments from public surveillance, we conclude that the officers involved acted in accordance with standard procedures. The use of force was deemed reasonable given the perceived threat of attack. No video was released. No one mentioned the taser shot that left Marissa unconscious, No questions were asked about why an unarmed woman was dragged through the street like a violent criminal. Inside a small apartment across town, Marissa sat upright at the table, eyes fixed on the live stream. Behind her, Mia gripped the handle of a coffee mug she'd poured long ago but forgotten. The text, crawling along the bottom of the screen, hit like a second shot. Delta Force incident. Internal review finds no misconduct. Marissa didn't speak, but her eyes narrowed. Not from fatigue, but like a sniper narrowing focus, seeing something others couldn't. For a moment, her face looked eerily calm, the kind of calm that comes only when there's nothing left to lose. She opened her laptop. On the screen, a still untouched audio file, choppy and low quality, recorded by the elderly neighbor's doorbell camera, but clear enough to make out Luke's voice. "You think being ex-military lets you ignore orders?" Followed by Nick's venom. "Women like you need to remember their place." Mia stepped forward, voice quiet, almost pleading. "We can appeal. A civil rights oversight group's ready to help us take this to the state." Marissa closed the laptop gently, and then they'll twist it again, like they just did. It took them 3 days. She stood, walked to the window. Afternoon sun filtered weakly through the dirty glass, casting a pale wash across her angular features. But what burned behind her eyes wasn't light. It was resolved. If the courts won't honor the truth, then I'm done bringing justice to courtrooms. Mia blinked. "What are you saying?" Marissa turned. Her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't sharp. It was low and precise, like a shot fired from cover. "From this point on, we're not fighting for forgiveness. We're making them pay." She stepped into her home office, where old military maps and mission dossiers still lay in boxes. She pulled them out and laid them across the table. Back in the Army, Marissa had planned operations to breach high-security facilities. Now she was applying the same skill set. Only this time her targets weren't insurgents, but 2 police officers protected by power and habit. She mapped it out. Luke's daily routines, Nick's shift schedules, weak points in their patterns, their routes, their off-duty stops, their tells. Every note, every mark on the page came from one truth. Rex was dead, and the system had chosen to protect the man who pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, online reaction to the no misconduct statement was swift and split. Some expressed disappointment, others fury. A few small voices began using the hashtag #JusticeForRex, mostly K-9 handlers, veterans, or people who had once worn the uniform. But the wave was still too small, and Marissa knew better than anyone. In America, justice doesn't rise from outrage. It rises from pressure and precision. She reopened the video of herself being dragged, not to relive the shame, but to dissect it. Every footstep Luke took, every flick of Nick's eyes, the angle of the camera, the faint siren in the distance. She watched it all like it was combat footage, frame by frame, reading it for patterns, for leverage, for opening. "You want to play this face up?" she muttered to the screen. "Then I'll lay the whole damn table down." Mia stood silently for a long moment. Then, finally, she pulled out her notebook, and, for the first time since leaving the newsroom, she picked up her pen, not to record the truth, but to drive it forward. 3 nights. Each night, Marissa parked 2 blocks from Claymore Pub and waited. She never stayed more than an hour, just long enough to observe. Binoculars, a dark notebook, and the steady calm of someone watching a hostile zone, not a city street. She memorized everything about Nick, the way he placed his glass on the bar, how he glanced over his shoulder every time his phone rang, the sway in his gait when he left, drunk on whiskey and invincibility. But it wasn't the drinking that interested her. It was the weakness in his routine. He always took the back alley to reach his car, a shortcut to a nearly empty staff lot. No lights, no cameras, just shadows he thought made him safe. the first mistake of men who think they're untouchable, misjudging the dark. On the fourth night, Marissa wore a gray hoodie and dark sweats. Her hair was pulled back tight. No weapon, just thin latex gloves and a length of rope in her backpack, like any night jogger prepping for jump rope drills. She waited behind a large dumpster at the alley's end, tucked just beyond the street lamp's reach, where neighborhood surveillance only caught shadow and blur. 10:11 p.m. Footstep echoed. Nick's voice, muttered to himself, slurred, dragging behind the stale scent of beer and cheap soap. She could hear the jangle of keys in his pocket. Rhythmic, familiar. 10:13. He staggered into the alley, exactly as predicted. He didn't look back. Men like him never did. A life spent walking forward while others moved aside. He whistled Bad Moon Risin', slapped the brick wall beside an old crate. A superstition, perhaps. 1 second later, Marissa emerged behind him like a whisper of smoke, both arms locked around his neck, slamming his back against the wall. Nick gasped, flailed, but it was clumsy. His skull hit brick with a short, dull thunk. What? She tightened her grip and leaned in, her voice low, razor cold. Remember the sound of that gun, Nick? He clawed backward, panicking. Marissa let him twist just enough to turn around, then drove her knee into his gut. He collapsed forward, breath knocked out, just in time to feel her arm slam across his chest, pinning him against the wall again. "Delta Force," she hissed. "Ring any bells?" Nick wheezed, hands raised, breath broken, sweat pouring despite the winter chill. His eyes went wide, not from pain, but because for the first time he truly understood. He had awakened something he could never put back to sleep. "You're fucking insane," he stammered. "I could call." She jabbed a finger into his chest. "Call who? The precinct? The one that helped you twist the story? Go ahead. Try." He went silent. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small Ziploc bag. Inside, a fragment of Rex's old ID tag, kept since their first deployment in Afghanistan. She shoved it into his coat pocket and kept her other hand on his throat, just enough pressure to remind him. She could finish this. "I'm going to reclaim every inch of honor you stole from him." Nick trembled. The same man who dragged her across the pavement was now leaning against brick, hands twitching by his hips, reaching, maybe, for a weapon, but not daring to draw. Marissa stepped back slowly, eyes locked on his. "I'm letting you live. Tonight." Then she turned and walked into the dark, slow, deliberate, leaving him frozen in place, breath shallow, the alley thick with the scent of fear. Only after her footsteps vanished did Nick finally fumble for his phone, hands shaking so hard it took 3 tries to dial. "Luke, she found me." "What? Who?" Luke's voice slurred, clearly drunk. "That bitch. That Delta bitch. I swear. She just... Wait, what the fuck are you talking about? She said she's going to reclaim the dog's honor. Rex, you hear me?" Luke's end was too noisy to catch everything, but Nick kept talking. "You don't get it, man. That woman, she's strong, like something unnatural, and she let me go. But I saw it in her eyes. Planning, fire, math. That woman's playing me like a game, and I swear to God, she's already ahead." The streetlights along 42nd Avenue faded as Marissa turned into a narrow alley behind a rundown bar on the city's southern edge. Inside, music pounded through the flimsy walls. Thudding bass, shrill laughter, clinking glasses, and the sharp click of heels against damp concrete. Just as she'd predicted, Luke was a creature of habit. He showed up nearly every weekend, sat at the same table, drank the same cheap liquor, and never noticed anyone unless they wore short skirts and fake smiles. She didn't need elaborate camouflage. Luke would never imagine that the woman he once dragged through the street, the one who wept over the body of a dog, was now the one haunting Nick's sleep, sending him into cold sweats at 3 a.m., trembling so hard he'd drop his gun during practice. And now, it was Luke's turn to learn fear. for the first time in his life. Earlier, Marissa had quietly approached a girl named Lacey, one of the bar's regulars, often handled by management, and handed her a wad of cash with a simple request: walk Luke into the alley. Just get him outside. What happens next doesn't involve you. Lacey didn't ask questions. She met Marissa's eyes once, eyes that held a silent war beneath their calm, a storm disciplined into silence, and nodded. Now Luke stood there, leaning against a stained concrete wall, one arm around Lacey's waist, the other nursing the end of a cigarette. He mumbled something crude, eyes glazed, focused only on the bare skin beneath her lace dress. "Go get us another round, baby," he said with a slap to her backside. Lacey nodded and walked away, her heels clacking like razors against the cement. And just seconds after she disappeared behind the door, a soft rustle cut through the air. Luke didn't even have time to turn. A hand clamped down on his shoulder and yanked him backward, slamming him into the wall. Before he could cry out, a gloved hand sealed his mouth shut, and his eyes went wide, first in surprise, then in terror. Marissa Hayes. "Evening, Officer Luke," she said, voice cold, low, and metallic. He struggled, but the alcohol made his limbs useless. Marissa swept his legs out from under him. He dropped, knees scraping the ground, arms flailing like a drowning man. She spun, wrapped her arm around his neck, locking it tight. He gasped for air, gurgled like a fish dragged from water. "Remember me?" The confidence drained from his eyes, the smugness, the mockery, gone. Only raw panic remained, and for the first time he said her name, Marissa. It came out like a curse, or a prayer. She leaned close to his ear. No shouting, no rage, just a whisper, steady and deliberate. "You kill my family." A clean punch slammed into his ribs, cutting off his breath. He tried to mumble something, maybe an apology, maybe a plea, but she pressed closer, voice sharp and heavy with finality. "I don't forgive." She struck again, and again. Not to kill, not yet, but enough to brand the pain into his body, deep, lasting, unforgettable. Under the flickering alley light, his face swelled and split, blood trailing from his nose and lips. When he was barely conscious, she let him collapse, crumpling to the ground like a bag of discarded bones. Marissa took one step back, her gaze fixed on the mess before her. "Rex didn't get the chance to defend himself," she said softly, more elegy than threat. Then she turned and walked away. Her steps were steady, calm, no panic, no rush, as if everything she'd needed to do had already been done. Outside the alley she paused, breathing deep, not from exhaustion but to push down the thing rising in her throat. Tonight, both Nick and Luke had dropped to their knees before her. The same men who once pulled her through the dirt, spat on her dignity, and killed what little she had left. Now they lay broken in shadows, undone by the very violence they once used to dominate others. But there was no relief in her chest. She looked up at the night sky, where clouds smothered the stars and felt only hollow stillness, like her rage had drained something vital from within. No thrill, no victory, just echoes of footsteps in her mind, Rex's, faithful and quiet, always by her side. "Breaking them isn't enough," she murmured, her eyes hardening in the dark. "They killed Rex. They buried my name. They turned truth into spectacle." A wind stirred her coat, as if reminding her that justice wasn't measured in bruises, but in records, in headlines, in testimony that couldn't be buried. Her punishment wouldn't end with fists. It would collapse, systemic, visible, and unavoidable. "I'll take it all back," she whispered, "and make sure your names are remembered as the face of what can never be forgiven." The next morning, in a closed-door conference room at the Brookfield District Police Department, the air was tight enough to snap. Nick sat at the head of the table, an ice pack pressed against his swollen cheek. He could barely move his jaw. Across from him, Luke brooded with his arm in a sling, eyes flickering between confusion and fury. They didn't have to speak to know what the other was thinking. Someone was hunting them. Someone had touched the nerve of the power they'd long believed was untouchable. It was her. Luke hissed through clenched teeth. That bitch came back. Nick's eyes burned. We need to find her. Now warrant, surveillance, pull the cameras near the bar last night. She'll have left a trail. And she had. The cameras caught everything. But just hours later, when tech analysts submitted the surveillance report from the Bellagio casino, the room fell into an uneasy silence. There she was, Marissa Hayes, in full view, black coat, hair tied tight, gaze cool but relaxed, seated at a blackjack table surrounded by witnesses. Cards shuffled, people laughed, chips exchanged hands. She raised a glass. She signed a receipt at the bar, spoke with a bartender. The timestamp matched the exact minute Luke was assaulted behind the dive bar, not a second off. Luke stared at the footage, his face draining of color. Nick mumbled, "No." I heard her voice in that alley. A young officer at the table ventured cautiously, "Is it possible we got the wrong person?" No one responded. But deep inside Nick, something shifted, cold, sharp, and dangerous. If that was Marissa in the video, then who the hell attacked him? Earlier that morning, while the briefing was still hours away, Marissa sat in Mia's apartment, flipping through case files her sister had pulled from independent press archives. Morning light spilled through the window, casting faint lines across her still bruised face. Beside her, Mia wore the same black coat from the night before, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "Are you sure no one noticed?" Marissa asked, not looking away from the screen. Mia gave a crooked smile. "I stood at the right camera angle and spoke just enough. The casino was noisy, crowded, and dark. No one noticed, not even the bartender. I signed your name in your hand, had 3 drinks, just enough to smell like it." Marissa reached out and placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. For the first time in days, her lips curved, not into a smirk, but a real smile. "You did well." Mia chuckled. "We grew up in a system where black, female, and too strong means always being seen through a distorted lens. I'm tired of proving your worth while men like Luke and Nick just wear a badge and get believed." Marissa nodded. "It's time they learned that black women's intelligence isn't in the gun we carry, but in knowing exactly when to pull the trigger and when to rig the trap." The night before had unfolded like a tactical mission, drawn and executed with precision. Marissa chose Bellagio for its heavy surveillance, abundant witnesses, and verifiable transaction logs. She and Mia arrived early, rehearsed the posture, lines, the exact tilt of a smile, even the way she touched her hair. The bartender even asked if you wanted the same cocktail as last time. Mia laughed. "I told him, just keep it cold and don't ask questions." He nodded. While Mia performed, Marissa slipped away, dressed in dark gear, hair tucked under a beanie, thin body armor beneath her jacket. She moved into the alley behind the bar, waited for Luke to stagger out, and delivered judgment. And, as seen now, it left just the right echo. Back in their apartment, Mia captured a still frame from leaked internal footage. Nick, stumbling out of the precinct, face battered, mumbling into his phone. "Look at this," she said, half smiling. "They're losing control. That will destroy them before we ever have to." Marissa didn't respond. She simply turned the old leash of Rex over in her hands, running her thumb across the rusted metal and faded scratches. The scent of aged leather still clung to it, as if Rex were right there beside her, breathing softly in the quiet. She closed her eyes. "That's strike 1, Rex," she whispered. "Now we let justice rise, not from bullets but from strategy." Across the city, Nick sat in his car, face ashen, staring at the report in his hands. Assault recorded at 11:16 p.m. Surveillance confirms Marissa Hayes present on video at Bellagio Casino from 10:30 p.m. to 3 a.m. Luke threw his phone to the floor. "We're playing against a goddamn monster with a brain." Nick turned slowly, voice low, each word forced through gritted teeth. "No, Luke, we've declared war on a nightmare that knows how to play chess." As the sun dipped behind the skyline, golden light filtered through the slats of Marissa's window blinds, staining her apartment in a pale orange haze, as if the evening itself had come to warn her of something silent and inevitable. She sat still in her chair, leaning forward slightly, one arm cradling her side, her head lowered, breath shallow, like she'd just come out of a violent coughing fit. Her eyes were locked on the empty space in front of her, but her mind was laying bricks, one by one, for the final trap. She knew Nick and Luke were at their edge. The calm precision of her strikes, leaving bruises, never answers, had cracked their judgment. To them, she was a threat to extinguish, but to her they were wounded animals, and that made them easier to bait. That night, her apartment sank into the shadows. She left no lights on. The balcony window, slightly open, hinted at carelessness. Inside, the scene was arranged just right. An empty bottle of painkillers on the table, her laptop open mid-email, and on the floor, Rex's leash lay untouched, like an open wound that refused to close. Around 2 a.m., the faintest click broke the silence. The lock being picked, no smashing, no boots. These were men who knew how to enter a room without being heard. Nick stepped in first, Glock tucked in the back of his waistband, hands tight, eyes scanning the dark. Luke followed close, flashlight sweeping the room, pausing on the slumped figure on the sofa. "Well, well," Luke whispered, voice hoarse from liquor and thrill. "Heard you're good at setting traps, soldier girl." Marissa didn't move. Her body trembled faintly, as though fevered. A streak of dried blood lined her temple. Her eyes half closed, breath shallow. "What's this?" Nick took a step closer. Finally cracked. Luke aimed the flashlight directly into her face. She flinched, weakly shielding her eyes, just enough to make them believe she was broken. Her hand trembled. Her shoulders sagged. She looked exactly as they needed her to look, defeated. "She's nothing," Luke growled, crouching to grab her chin. "What now? Afraid? Survive battlefields just to fold under a few threats and some dirt?" Nick stood still, his gaze stuck on Rex's leash. "The only thing that ever protected you," he muttered, "is already in the ground." Marissa's lips parted, voice raspy, barely audible. "Rex died with honor. You'll die in disgrace." "What?" Luke snarled, gripping her collar to drag her up. But before he could lift her, Marissa let her body go limp, collapsing to the floor like dry timber. Luke burst out laughing. "Turn around, Nick. Look at this. All that legend. Bullshit. The media loves a myth." But Nick didn't laugh. He stood frozen, jaw tight, because he remembered the pressure of a hand against his throat, the cold voice that had stalked him in the dark. "I'll reclaim every inch of Rex's honor." A minute later, they left. They knocked over a chair on the way out, left a few bruises on her arms. Luke's voice echoed in the hallway. "You're smart to stay down. Should have done it sooner." The door clicked shut. Inside, Marissa lay still for 3 more seconds, then opened her eyes, calm and sharp. She sat up, adjusted her collar, rolled her shoulder. All 4 cameras were still recording. Miniature, wireless, planted into the vent, the nightlight, the bookshelf, and the wall clock. Each stream transmitted in real time to an encrypted backup drive in Mia's home. Everything had been captured. The insults, the threats, the hands, the gleam of Luke's flashlight, the aggression, the intent. What no camera could record, though, was her expression. The look of someone who had lost everything and was now reclaiming justice by her own code. Morning light spilled through the window panes like fractured beams after a storm. In the living room, Marissa sat back in her chair, eyes locked on the screen in front of her. Files lined the desktop, videos, documents, statements, all meticulously arranged. Mia stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the mouse, inhaling deeply as though she were about to pull the trigger on a weapon they'd spent weeks building. One click, and the quake began. The first clip showed Nick and Luke breaking into Marissa's home. A ceiling camera caught it all. Their entry, their fists, their slurred curses. Everything was framed in sharp relief under the lamp's pale glow. No denials, no edits. Alongside the footage, Mia uploaded an archive of documents she'd spent months verifying. Internal complaints against Luke for excessive force, a handwritten letter from a landlady describing the time he shoved an elderly woman to the ground over a noise complaint, and 3 civil suits alleging unlawful detention by Nick, cases that somehow never made it beyond internal review before quietly disappearing. Mia published everything across 3 major platforms, including a leading investigative civil rights outlet. She didn't add sensational headlines. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Within the first 3 hours, the post hit 2 million views. By noon, comment sections were flooding with outrage. This is law enforcement? Why does a woman have to suffer like this in her own home? Delta Force? And they still treated her like a threat because of her skin? The truth didn't need embellishment. It burned bright under the glare of irrefutable evidence. At 5 p.m., a citywide news broadcast cut in with a hastily recorded statement from the chief of police. As the head of this department, I take full responsibility for the internal failures. My decision to resign is personal, rooted in ethics, and in honor of this badge. Marissa and Mia sat silent as the screen faded. Even knowing it was inevitable, they hadn't expected the collapse to come this fast. The same man who once worked to shield his officers now stared blankly into a camera, a passenger in the unraveling of the machine he thought he controlled. Next came a news segment. Nick storming down a station hallway, 2 reporters at his heels, questions flying like darts. Do you have a comment on the footage released this morning? Are you accepting personal responsibility for your actions? Do you believe you abused your authority? He didn't answer. His face locked down, pale and tight, like a man realizing hell wasn't beneath his feet. It had caught up to him. At a hastily convened police department meeting, over 30 internal staff signed a petition requesting full reinvestigation of all cases involving Nick and Luke. Some veterans refused to speak publicly, but internal memos leaked one line over and over. Something's been wrong for a long time. We can't pretend anymore. Back in the apartment, Marissa's phone rang nonstop. A TV producer offered her a primetime interview, a civil rights group offering to fund a full-scale investigation, a national news anchor requesting a live sit-down. She chose none of them. She looked at Mia instead, calm, firm, eyes unwavering. I don't need a spotlight. I need justice. Mia nodded. She understood. This wasn't about attention. It never had been. What Marissa wanted was never vengeance and headlines. It was changing from the roots. And, remarkably, the ground had begun to shift. Lower-level officers withdrew their support for Nick and Luke. The department's legal team received a mayoral request to re-examine every arrest connected to the two. Within 24 hours of the video going public, a motion to convene a formal hearing landed on the district attorney's desk. Meanwhile, Nick and Luke began to feel the very weight Marissa had carried alone. Only difference, they weren't built to withstand it. Internal forums lit up. Colleagues called their actions a disgrace. One post read, "If we let this happen and say nothing, we're just as guilty." A prominent legal blogger dissected the footage in a detailed breakdown of protocol violations. His closing words hit like a gavel. If these two aren't prosecuted, then the word justice needs a new definition in this country. That night, the local news station broadcast the footage over heavy background music, each beat pounding like a warning bell. The images were undeniable. Nick and Luke breaking into Marissa's home, hurling insults, beating an unarmed black woman in her own living room. Frame by frame, it played out in brutal clarity. Marissa curled on the floor, blood trailing from her lip and temple, her cheek swollen. The anchor paused, voice catching for a second before reading the bold red banner beneath the footage. 2 officers accused of assaulting Delta Force veteran. Victim's video shakes city. Within an hour, social media ignited. Justice for Marissa and injustice for Rex surged to the top of national trends. Voices that once stayed silent now spoke up. Even those who defended reasonable police force began to hesitate, and in deeper corners of the country, where people of color still moved through the world with quiet dread, a storm of fury began to rise, burning like wildfire after a long drought. Outside City Hall, the first protesters gathered. It began with a few students wearing black t-shirts printed with Rex was family. Then came the mothers, holding their children in signs that read, "She protected us abroad. Who protects her here?" Then came the veterans, black, Latinx, even white, men and women who had served in the same elite units as Marissa, who knew what sacrifice truly meant. They came not to riot, but to guard the truth. The honor of a soldier is not something power gets to rewrite. On a makeshift stage, Mia stepped forward with a microphone. Behind her, a portrait of Marissa and Rex, once mocked by the press, now stood as a symbol. Her voice rang out over the crowd. She risked her life for this country, and now has to beg for justice in her own home. They killed Rex like his life meant nothing. They beat my sister like she never served under a single command. But what they forgot is this. We remember, and we no longer forgive silence. Thousands roared in unison, "Justice! Justice!" By dawn, the city's main streets were frozen. National media caught fire. CNN's headline, "Police Assault on Female Veteran Sparks National Outrage." The New York Times ran a 3-page op-ed tracing the history of police violence against black women, long buried beneath flashier headlines. State legislators submitted a formal petition to create an independent review board. Civil rights attorney Marcus DeWitt, famed for taking on LAPD in 2015, announced he would represent Marissa pro bono. They didn't just strike a woman, he said. They struck the dignity of every community that's endured too much for too long. But the moment that silenced the nation came from a child. A video showed a young brown-skinned boy, maybe 7 years old, standing in a plaza, holding a poster written in messy marker, "Justice for Rex," and for all of us. His wide, serious eyes, sincere and fierce, were shared millions of times. One viral comment read, "If a 7-year-old knows what's right, why doesn't the system?" Pressure on the police department mounted. At an emergency press conference, the PR chief barely made it through the opening lines before shouts drowned him out. How do you justify beating a woman in her own home? Was Rex a threat or a victim? Are you still calling this reasonable force? That night, outside the homes of Nick and Luke, hundreds gathered. No chants, no bricks, just tents, candles, photos of Rex. They held vigil, not to intimidate but to remind. Their silence was more terrifying than any scream. A local columnist wrote, "Tonight, resolve has replaced fear, and from one soldier's pain, the city has rediscovered its collective conscience." Marissa sat alone in her apartment, the window cracked open to let in the night air. She watched the candlelight flicker below. It would never fill the space Rex left behind, but it brought something else. Truth, finally lit, not by promises, but by people. And she wasn't alone anymore. Soft amber light filtered through the courtroom window of the Monroe County Courthouse as the special hearing began. Not with shouting, not with protests in the streets like before. This time, no one needed to yell. The evidence spoke for itself. In a private chamber, 12 citizens sat in silence, a grand jury composed of different races, backgrounds, and stories. They watched the footage, Luke and Nick bursting into Marissa's home, the doorbell audio from Mrs. Halbert's house, the internal documents Mia's team had unearthed, medical reports detailing Marissa's injuries, murky disciplinary records that had been quietly shelved. A pen tapped against the table in a slow, steady rhythm, a rhythm of conscience waking up. In the hallway outside, Marissa stood holding Rex's collar, the one that snapped the night she lunged toward the gun that stole her closest friend. Her face wasn't tense anymore. There was a quiet glow now, a light that comes only after surviving pain and learning what patience truly means. At exactly 10:13 a.m., the assistant district attorney exited the jury room, a thick file in hand. He nodded solemnly at the interim police chief stationed by the door. Moments later, it was official. The indictments were public, televised, witnessed by hundreds outside the courthouse and watched live by millions more. Nick, once the arrogant commander of street raids, now stumbled forward, hands cuffed tightly behind him. He wore his uniform, but sweat stained his underarms, his skin pale, eyes darting like prey that finally realized it was hunted. Behind him, Luke staggered, nearly dragged by internal affairs officers, muttering protests, still thick with the hangover of the previous night. The crowd outside raised signs high, bold against the courthouse backdrop. Justice for Rex, and for all of us. Across the nation, that image, 2 police officers in cuffs, became the turning point. It wasn't just a reckoning for one incident. It was a crack in the steel wall of silence that had shielded a broken system for too long. Later that afternoon, in the southern outskirts of the city, Marissa returned to a cemetery she'd visited weeks earlier, alone, soaked in rain. This time, she carried a bouquet of white chrysanthemums and a stamped copy of the indictment decision. She knelt quietly before the gravestone, hands trembling slightly as she laid the flowers down over the soil where Rex was buried. No thunder, no wind, just the stillness of something final finally being said. "I promised you your death wouldn't be forgotten," she whispered. "I kept my word." She placed a small metal keychain beside the flowers, engraved with a 5-pointed star, the emblem of Delta Force, a final honor for a soldier who never wore a rank, never signed a contract, but had guarded the line between life and death beside her through countless missions. A thin breeze stirred the black ribbon tied to the bouquet. Above, a flock of crows flew in a tight arc across the sky, like a formation in silent farewell, then vanished behind silver clouds. Marissa looked up, eyes following the flight. Her heart was heavy, but finally at rest. She knew part of her life ended here, but the fight for justice, for Rex, and for every life crushed in the name of order had only just begun. That morning, the courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with journalists, civil rights activists, black veterans, and everyday citizens who had once felt injustice but never found the words. Silence hung over them, not out of fear, but focus. Every gaze centered on the black woman standing at the witness stand, a place once associated with voicelessness, now thunderous with truth. Marissa wore a simple white blouse. The faint scar on her wrist from that night was still visible. Light poured in from the tall window, casting a soft glow across her tied-back hair and unwavering face. She stood tall, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the jury, not as a victim, but as a soldier walking into battle without weapons, armed only with memory, pain, and truth. "Please tell us what happened on the night of July 3rd, the prosecutor asked, voice calm but firm. Marissa gave a small nod. She didn't glance at notes. Every detail lived inside her like a scar etched in stone. "I had just returned from a long deployment overseas. Rex, a retired K-9 who served beside me in Afghanistan, was the only soul I trusted. We were walking down a familiar street, a neighborhood I once called home. She paused. Her hands tightened slightly where they were clasped. Just a second, but the whole courtroom felt the ache rise in her chest. That's when two officers, Nick and Luke, approached. They questioned me, not because I did anything, but because of how I looked, because of the color of my skin. When I refused to answer their disrespectful questions, the tone shifted. The prosecutor nodded, encouraging. I was trained to control emotion. On the battlefield, a blink can mean death. I didn't react, but Rex did. He was built to protect. When they drew their guns and ordered me to turn my back, Rex sensed danger. He stepped forward, just one step, and then a bullet tore through his chest. Her voice faltered, as if she had to dig into herself to bring the memory up like pulling glass from skin. I begged them. I pleaded with everything I had for them to call for help. I told them he was more than a dog. He was my partner, my family. They laughed, said it was just an animal, and then they tased me. I woke up in cuffs, being dragged down the street like a criminal. Across the courtroom, fists clenched, a middle-aged woman began to cry, hand covering her mouth to stifle the sound. In the third row, a veteran tilted his head down, not in shame but in recognition. His eyes shimmered with a wordless bond. Marissa's gaze shifted. She looked directly at Nick and Luke, seated at the defense table. Their faces were pale, their posture sunken. The swagger was gone, replaced by the quiet dread of men who had finally found themselves face to face with real justice. "I'm not here for sympathy," she said, voice steady. "I don't need pity. I need justice. For Rex. Not just a dog, but a soldier. A soul who served this country no less than any human. Rex can't speak for himself, but I can, and I will, because hundreds, thousands like me have suffered in silence, and abuse of power doesn't start with violence. It starts with disdain, with a look, a word, with a system that wraps prejudice in a uniform and calls it duty. A stillness followed, thick, unbroken. I don't forgive, not because I hate, but because forgiveness must come after acknowledgement, after truth is called by its name, after justice is done. And today, I believe justice is finally listening. The defense attorney tried to push back, but every rebuttal rang hollow against the image of Marissa kneeling beside Rex, an image now etched into national consciousness. No legal strategy could erase what the world had already seen. As Marissa stepped down from the stand, the entire courtroom rose. No one instructed them, no command was given, but everyone stood. And in that quiet moment, the judge's bowed head, the jurors' slow nods, and the gentle touch on her shoulder from a white woman in the front row, Marissa knew. Her voice had reached deeper than the court. It had stirred something in the country's collective memory. And this time, the truth wasn't suffocated in silence. Beneath the high dome of the federal courthouse, the air hung thick, as if even time itself were holding its breath. The spectator benches were packed. Journalists, civil rights attorneys, military veterans of color, and ordinary citizens who had once taken to the streets demanding justice for Marissa Hayes and Rex. On the defendant's bench, Nick and Luke sat motionless. Their gray-blue suits could not conceal the pallor in their cheeks or the tremble at the corners of their mouths. The charges, read through the microphone, were clear, precise, and damning, ripping away the layers of impunity they had once believed untouchable. Judge Brenton, an Asian-American jurist known for his strict but fair demeanor, adjusted his glasses and turned to the final page of a file he'd studied for weeks. His voice was slow, deliberate, and heavy, as though carrying the weight of every cry heard in the streets. Having reviewed the full body of visual evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the defendant's prior disciplinary records, The grand jury has reached its conclusion. Coordinated abuse of power, assault on a civilian, the unlawful killing of a service animal, and perjury before a court of law, each charge proven beyond reasonable doubt. The room fell silent for a beat. Some gripped the hands of loved ones. Others inhaled sharply. Marissa remained still in the front row, shoulders square, jaw steady. But inside, waves surged. She'd waited for this moment since Rex's eyes closed for the last time in her lap, as his blood soaked into her knees on an anonymous sidewalk. The court hereby sentences Gregory Nick and Thomas Luke to 25 years in federal prison. No parole, no early release. Sentences begin immediately. The judge's gavel hit the block with a final thud. The room erupted. Applause roared like a summer storm. Some stood and shouted, "Justice for Rex," a phrase that had become a rallying cry in a city once muted by fear. Tears streamed down Mia's face as she clutched the hand of a colleague too overcome to speak. Human rights lawyers nodded solemnly at one another. This was more than justice for one woman or one loyal dog. It was a reckoning for communities long drowned beneath the weight of unchecked power. Marissa stood. She walked calmly toward the aisle as the two men were led away in cuffs. Luke turned his face, but Nick met her gaze, his eyes bloodshot with hatred and fear. She stopped a few feet from him, voice steady and clear for all to hear. Rex didn't die in vain. Her words carried no flair, no venom, just truth, quiet and absolute. A full stop to a long sentence of violence, silence, and systemic denial. As the defendants disappeared into the hallway, flashbulbs burst like silent fireworks. But Marissa saw only Rex, not the moment he lay still, but the day they ran side by side across a training field in Central Asia, their breath ragged, eyes bright, like two children playing tag in a war zone. That memory rose silently, an embrace from the past, warm and defiant. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled around her. A young black boy, maybe 8, pushed through, holding up a crumpled drawing. A dog in a soldier's cap with scribbled words underneath. "Thank you, Miss Marissa. Thank you, Rex." She knelt, took the picture with both hands. Her fingers trembled, not with rage, not with grief, but with life returning to a heart once cracked wide open. Mia stepped forward and hugged her from behind. "You did it," she whispered. Marissa didn't reply right away. She looked up at the sky, where the light was shifting, soft and gold, where Rex might be, somewhere among the falling rays. "I'm not finished," she finally said, voice firm, eyes locked on the horizon. "There are too many like Rex, loyal, brave, left behind in courtrooms that were never even opened." And in that moment, she was no longer just a soldier with a history stained in war. She was a pathfinder, for justice, for memory, and for everyone ever denied the dignity of simply being seen as human in their own hometown. Months after the trial, the city, once shaken to its core by outrage, began to slowly breathe again. But for Marissa Hayes, nothing could return to what it once was. She still visited Rex's grave every week, bringing the bits of meatloaf he used to love and sitting in silence for hours, as if by listening hard enough, she might once again hear the soft scratch of paws on tile or the warm breath nudging her hand at sunrise. Then she would rise slowly, not to return to her old, shadowed house, but to something new. Justice through code. These lessons were threaded into every class. A cybersecurity module that began with the story of a forged email that cost someone their job. A lesson on AI using the example of facial recognition software that had once falsely accused black citizens. Every lesson was a reminder. Real protection starts with understanding. Mia, her sister, also came to teach. She showed the kids how to read news critically, how to question what's real and what's spin, and how to protect their voices from being rewritten. One afternoon, As sunlight streamed through the windows, Mia glanced toward her sister standing at the front of the class. A small photo sat next to the projector. Rex, tongue lolling in a grin, amber eyes shining like they held a whole other sky. Mia turned to the class and asked quietly, "Do you know why that photo is always up there?" Malik answered softly, "Because he kept Ms. Marissa safe, and now she keeps us safe." The room fell silent, and Marissa, turning from the whiteboard, smiled faintly, gratefully, but her eyes held something deeper. Rex might no longer be alive, but his loyalty lived on. In each line of code, each time a child stood up to a teacher who treated them unfairly, each moment a student dared say no to a command that didn't feel right, letters began arriving. Notes from single mothers whose kids had been profiled at school, from black veterans who had never spoken about the beatings they endured in silence, from young girls who once dreamed of becoming engineers but gave up because they never saw anyone who looked like them in the field. Marissa read every word, kept every envelope, and turned them into curriculum, lesson plans, a quiet network of change. At night, as the city quieted, Marissa often stayed behind. She'd brew cocoa, open her laptop, and rewatch footage from the day's classes, not to monitor, but to remember every look of wonder, every question asked without fear. When the screen showed Malik leaning over to help a classmate write an if-else statement, she chuckled softly. Then she reached for a small frame on the shelf, the one photo she'd carried from deployment to retirement. Her and Rex outside their base, the desert sun casting gold across his coat, both their gazes fixed on something just beyond the camera. She set the photo beside her monitor, and for a moment she sat still, as if saying something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "You kept me safe, Rex. Now it's my turn to protect the ones coming after us." Outside, the lights from Justice through Code stayed on through the night, not just to guide the way home, but to remind the city. A black woman, once dragged through the streets for loving a life others dismissed as just a dog, chose to turn her pain into knowledge, her memory into movement. And from that, a new generation was born. Marissa Hayes' story didn't begin in glory. It began with pain twisted into guilt. She didn't collapse after Rex's death. She didn't scream when they dragged her through the street. Instead, she stood up with the strength of a soldier, the clarity of a citizen, and the unwavering love for truth. When the system turned its back, she faced it head-on. When the media painted her as a threat, she became the living memory of all those who had been denied one. But Marissa's victory wasn't the 25-year sentence handed to her abusers. Her triumph was in not teaching the children revenge, but teaching them to code, to understand their civil rights, and to recognize that justice sometimes begins not with a gun, but with a line of logic, a questioning gaze, a whisper that keeps truth alive. In a world still heavy with shadows, Marissa chose to become light, quiet, steady, and never fading. What do you think of Marissa's choice? Teaching code to defend justice instead of picking up a weapon. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe, and help us amplify stories of courage where justice doesn't have to scream to be heard. It just needs to be lived.